All right, it's time for another light reading book review. The book review I'm going to be doing today is Ordinary Men, subtitled Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland by Christopher R. Browning. A little light reading. This was published twice, once in 1992 and once in 1998. This is the 1998 version. The difference being is there's kind of an afterword section where an academic challenged the author about how this type of thing could just happen to anybody and ignore the prevalent anti-Semitic tendency that was in Europe that played into the whole genocide of the Jewish people in World War II. The whole premise of this book, though, is not to so much focus on the who was being persecuted, but how ordinary, otherwise normal people can be convinced to become genocidal warriors, which is exactly what happened to Reserve Police Department or Police Battalion 101 in Poland. These guys were from an area of Germany that was the least Nazified. I forget which city it was. You'll have to read the book for that. They were police officers. Some of them were older, a lot of them were younger, and they basically became agents of genocide. And how you could take a group of, some of them were Nazi Party leader or members, some of them weren't. Some of them were older, so they knew the life before Hitler took over. Some of them were younger, had been brought up in the 30s, where they're reaching adulthood now, and they'd been through all the Nazi propaganda. But it's about as close that you can come in World War II to try to find a group of people that came from the least Nazified area that became a group of people that formed shooting squads that killed Jews en masse and participated in guarding trains going to various it wasn't Auschwitz, but it was other areas where they killed tons of people. And all these guys played a part. And how did that happen? How could you convince these guys to do it? And the book, I don't think really talks so much about how, it just talks about it happened, And so let's talk about that. I've got some notes that I want to bring up that are important. One is you have to be, and these are kind of the takeaways from this book. I'd say this book, I don't know if this should be required reading for like high school students, but it should be in a bucket of required reading about serious topics, and one of them is how to get ordinary people to commit genocide. People should understand that process so they can avoid it in their society. And when you read this book, you can kind of see even the embryonic state of some of the stuff in our society that, if it isn't checked, could get really ugly. And we'll talk about that. And that's why I think this is an important book to read. Hopefully it's not mirror imaged here. But I wouldn't say necessarily force kids to read it, but they should have to pick and choose out of a group of books like this. Orwell's 1984, the other one, Huxley's Brave New World, stuff like that. This one should be in a bucket list where, say there's 30 books in it and kids have to read 5 of them, and you can pick and choose. But from kind of doing almost like an inoculation of society from the concepts that these books deal with. And this particular concept is taking people who otherwise would be decent people and turning them into mass murderers. What are the takeaways from the book that, how can that happen? Well, I think one of them is you obviously have an existing disconnect between one group of people in Germany and the other. And that disconnect was the Jewish population. The Jewish population had been a scapegoat for European problems for a long, long time. And that was prevalent in Germany. So when Germany lost World War I and they blamed it on, an external force that was keeping Germans down, the Jews became a convenient scapegoat. So what's the takeaway for that? It becomes easier to commit crimes of atrocity against groups that are marginalized, belittled, and eventually dehumanized. So when you see politicians and media and those type of people in your own country start to do those type of things, you need to hold that in check. And I think in America today, it's not so much based on race, although there's definitely rising racism now, which is unfortunate. It's also a lot to do with ideology. Like if you see one group say, oh, conservatives are a bunch of conspiracy QAnon whack jobs, and we need to censor them, we need to, possibly take their kids away and re-educate them, that's kind of going down the path. And it happens on the other side where conservatives talk about liberals are all communist and shouldn't be in power and shouldn't be in our country. That type of talk, we need to be able to separate people's opinions that we don't like and not just tar them as, first people that are dangerous and then eventually pushing them into a role where they're subhuman. Because once you've got a large percentage of your population viewing another percentage of the population as less than human because of their ideology, because of their race or whatever, it's much easier for people to manipulate them to commit atrocities. So that's takeaway one. Takeaway two, on the whole Jewish part, like a lot of people don't understand, why did they so willingly go into the gas chambers? Why didn't they resist? Some of them did resist, but the whole concept is that the poor Jewish people that have been living in Europe had been abused for a long time. They were used to programs, I'm pronouncing the word wrong, but basically government programs against the Jewish people. They kind of came, they kind of went. So initially when this started to happen in Nazi Germany to target the Jews, a lot of the Jewish people thought that this would be like a passing phase like it had been in the past. So they didn't necessarily react to it immediately like they might have if they knew what was coming. So that's one thing to take away is keep that cognitive bias and normalcy bias in check. If you see bad things starting to happen, really logic it through and try to keep your predispositions of what normalcy is. When you see storm clouds gathering, react to them. Another thing is I do believe, and the author goes against this in his afterword, where basically saying it's not so much a Jewish thing as far as the targeting of them and the continued targeting of Jewish people throughout history. It's more of like how one group can demonize another group, and it doesn't matter what group is being demonized, this horrible things can happen. And that's kind of the whole point of the book. And I would argue yes, but I would also argue there is a special kind of persecution that happens to the Jewish people, and I think that can be demonstrated throughout history. And I, as a Christian, would attribute that as a spiritual thing, where there is forces of darkness that don't like the fact that the Jewish people were given the oracles of God, and they target them, and they work through, humans that give their emotions over to hate, and then these dark forces can kind of manipulate them and force them to go after, or encourage them to go after the Jewish people. So I do kind of disagree with the author. I think there is a special persecution that happens towards the poor Jewish people. But I also think that the author's premise that this can happen to any group is also valid as well. So you want to make sure that you're not in a society that views you as a group that are the cause of all their problems. Like if you're living in America and it becomes more dystopic in, say 30 or 40 years, and you're on the ideological side that gets blamed for all the problems, get out. Or any country. I think that's a good takeaway too. Another sad fact is if there's a group that's persecuted and their loss is another group's gain, or the prevailing group's gain, don't expect a lot of people in that prevailing group to be incentivized to help you. Like a lot of people in Germany that were Jewish people were business owners, lawyers, and as they got shut down and crushed, other ethnic German people were able to step in and pick up that business. So there was a de-incentive for them to help as well. And I think that's important to understand and try to If you see that happening, that's another reason to get out of Dodge as well. Another thing that happened was incremental persecution. You know, it's the pot, it's the frog and the slowly heating to eventually boiling pot of water. You know, when you're in it and it just increases up a little bit daily, and it can even get more rapid, but you're used to being persecuted. Like, you know, you've got to, say in America, again, using us as an example, you've got a certain political opinion, and at first you're censored. At first you're, you know, you might post something on Facebook and somebody says that you're an extremist and reports you to some kind of Facebook thing. And then your news sources that you get are considered, you know, against the prevailing viewpoint, so they're shut down. You know, it starts off like that, and then it goes up and up and up. So you have to kind of, when you're in it, excuse me, I'm a little under the weather. It might be hard to see that incrementalism. You know, you don't see the scale of it because you're in it. So you want to pay attention, and if you see it incrementing, politically fight against it. Say, no, our society's not going to go that way, and use any political power you can to stop it. Also, if you're a Christian, pray to stop it. You know, and if you see that happening to any group, maybe it's not the group that you're in, but another group, even the group that you hate, you should stop it, because if it can happen to one group, it can also be switched and happen to another group. Like if your constitutional rights fade and become just vestigial and don't really do anything anymore, but it's mostly affecting this group, that doesn't mean it can't shift and affect your group, so you need to watch out for that. Another thing uniquely to the German culture, but is trying to be engineered into our culture and many cultures, is a culture of obedience. I'm half German. I know many Germans. My mother's almost full German. They seem to be like really good at taking orders, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. They just are a very organized societal group, and in that societal group, they're used to specialists making decisions and then the rest of the group following along. And I can see that in America. You know, it's like, you know, don't question settled science. What is settled science? There's no such thing as settled science. Science should always be able to be challenged and revisited, and new things that are discovered brought into the discussion, which might shed light on other things. You know, and the whole idea of teaching people what to think rather than how to think is all bad. So as we see obedience more continually engineered into the system, the more obedient a society is, the more it doesn't challenge authority, the more it looks at society as I would argue, a communist or a socialist, remember the Nazis were socialist, regime where the center makes the decisions for everybody and then for the greater good, and then everybody follows along, rather than traditionally what was an American worldview where you had every person's a sovereign citizen. The government acts as a ref to keep everybody from abusing their fellow citizens, but it's not a command and control. And we see our society shifting towards that, and I would argue that is an indicator that would allow possible future genocide to happen. I'm not saying it will, or that's all it takes, but I'm saying that is an indicator that would show that it could go that way. Right, a couple other takeaways from the book. For this particular police battalion, when they were ordered to do their first mass shooting of Jewish people, the commander went out and said, I know a lot of you older veterans are not going to be able to do this, and if you want to step out, you don't have to. Some of them did, but very few. And those very few were ridiculed, some to some degree, by their fellow troops as being weak, or this is kind of a military police unit, I guess would be the equivalent in the U.S. military. It was kind of made up of normal police. They kind of got nationalized into military police and used as kind of auxiliaries while the rest of the Wehrmacht or the regular German army fought. These guys would come in and occupy areas of Poland, and their orders were to make these areas over time Juden free or Jewish free, and that meant extermination. So the first time they were ordered to do it, some of the older guys were given the opportunity to bow out. Another small group didn't officially bat out, but pretended to be doing things, or at least they claimed, and again, it's hard to tell, because obviously, it was a horrible crime, and when you're being reviewed by German prosecutors, which the testimony is what this book is based on, you might embellish how you really weren't a part of it when in reality you were. But this group is the most documented and the most interviewed after the war. That's why this particular author chose this group. Anyway, there was a small group who just bowed out, and they were allowed to. There was the small group who, pretended to be busy doing other things and avoided actually participating in the first shooting. And then there was another group who participated in the shooting, but after they'd shot, 5 or 10 people, including women or children, they couldn't do it anymore, and they were allowed to leave. But the preponderance of the group followed through and did as ordered and did mass executions. And I think the takeaway is, and none of the groups, the small group who bowed out, the other small group who were busy, and then later some of those people were, they'd go out on partisan hunts, or they call them Jew hunts. I mean, horrible stuff. And they claimed that they might catch a few Jewish people that were hiding out and let them go because no one was around to see it. I don't know if that's true or not. But none of them, not a single one, at least according to this book, picked up arms and fought back against Germany. So for those of you out there who think that if this country or whatever country in goes despotic, dystopic, and orders its military against a group of citizens, if you're expecting that military or police or federal agencies or whatever to stop and say, no, we're not going to do that, that's an unlawful order. This book says that there's an extremely high compliance rate among armed force police types to do what they're ordered. Some of them might bow out, some of them might kind of fool around and pretend they're doing something else, but none of them are going to fight back. Now, American culture, obviously, or the culture of whatever country you're in, is probably going to be a little bit different than Germany. You might not have that level of cultural obedience that Germany did. So in America, there might be a greater percentage of people in the military or police that, if given those orders, would not do them. But the chances of them actually fighting back are probably low. So you need to take that away. And the takeaway for that is you can't just sit around. I know a lot of people who can see bad trends happening and are, just expect somebody to step in and turn it around, or if it does go down, then, the military won't do that, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, they probably will. I think that's a big takeaway. Another thing is, a lot of the times for the hardcore killing, you had the elite groups of SS or auxiliaries. There was all these Eastern European countries around that had really strong hatred for Jewish people. So the police groups would kind of organize these auxiliaries of Lithuanians or whatever to come in, and they would do most of the killing. And they had to get drunk to do it, but they would, and sometimes they'd get so drunk. It's hard to kill people. People think in video games you just go pew, pew, pew. Another book that I might review is called On Killing. It's human beings aren't really meant to kill other people, and when they do, there's effects. And for some people can do it. But anyway, the use of auxiliary. So, a lot of times, let's say there's a dictatorship and they want their soldiers to go wipe out a group. They won't use the soldiers. They'll use the soldiers to organize another subgroup who really hates that group. Let's switch the politics around that I've been using. Let's say a conservative dictatorship takes over and orders the military to, wipe out all Black Lives Matter activists. And the military goes, no. Well, they might predict that and go, well, we're not going to use the military to do that. We're going to use a bunch of, this conservative group over here who really hates BLM and has vocalized that they'd like to shoot them all. So we're going to bring them in. We're just going to have the military supervise them. Because another important part is the more levels of distance you can get away from the actual killing, the compliance of troops carrying out the orders almost goes up to 100%. We'll get into that in just a sec. But anyway, you have them, you use the groups that hate the other groups to do the actual killing, and you use your regular military to kind of organize that. That's one way to get higher compliance in the military to follow the orders of the police or ordinary people. Another way is to make it a system. You had the system of, you know, the Auschwitzes and all that, and then you have the military just play small parts in the system. There's a military that goes in the ghettos and rounds the people up. There's a military that puts them on the trains. There's another group that guards them. There's another group that leads them into the concentration camp. And then there's another group that puts the gas thing in. And there's another group made up of probably Jewish people that are trying to stay alive in the concentration camp that takes out the bodies. So only like 2 groups out of the whole chain are actually involved in seeing the end result, and the rest are all kind of pushed away from the end result. You get compliance that goes up to almost like 100% as far as killing. So that's just horrible. So anyway, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is this book should be read. I think it's worthwhile to read. I didn't quite finish the second editions afterward. It got a little bit academic for me and kind of boring. As a Christian, I believe there is a spiritual component to what happens to poor Jewish people throughout history. But anyway, it's a must-read. It's dated. It's probably hard to find, but I'm sure you can still find it on Amazon. If I was a big account, I'd have an Amazon affiliate link, but I'm not, so I'm not going to bother. So hardcore stuff. And it's stuff that people should understand, because as you see society taking steps towards getting to the point where genocide can be an option against political dissent or groups, ethnic groups that aren't liked or whatever, you need to step up your game politically and make sure that doesn't happen. Like, I think one of the things in America is just political tribalism is getting so hateful. We need to get back to the point where we can say, I disagree with you and your opinion. I think you're full of it. But you're an intelligent being. I'm going to let you have your own opinion. I'm going to debate it, and I hope you can debate back with me in a civilized manner without resorting to violence. But I'm going to let you have your opinion. You're going to let me have mine. I think we need to get back. We need to stop letting people bully other people that have different opinions and be hateful on them. That's unacceptable, and it'll eventually lead to something along these lines. You know, maybe not genocide, but persecution and whatever. So in understanding all that stuff, I think this is a good book to read, and you should read it. So I'm going to stop there. We'll do another book review. I'm not sure on what yet. So if you are into books that are meaningful and not just stupid stuff, follow along. Thanks.